very distinguished panel of speakers, Professor Sumatra Bose from the London School of Economics, Tom Kaplan from World Affairs Journal, convener Mr. G. Parthasarthi, who needs absolutely no introduction, not in this city at least, and Admiral Premveer Das, who also needs no introduction. The topic that they will all be discussing is whether instabilities in South Asia should be attributed to our colonial past, or is it the birth pangs of rising democracies. We'd like to certainly hear from all of you at the end of the session, but the format that Aspen Institute has is a sort of freewheeling discussion, and we will start by, shall I start with Professor Sumatra Bose? Professor Bose, how much of instability in South Asia should we attribute to our colonial past? And since you look at a lot of comparative politics, especially in the post-colonial period, could you give us a view on it?
Sure. Well, it's hard to deny that many of our problems of instability in this region have colonial origins. And let me give an example right away from one of our neighboring countries, Sri Lanka, where a 25-year civil war ended just 7 months ago. When the British withdrew from Sri Lanka, more or less, in 1948, they bequeathed a form of government to Sri Lanka that was then known as Ceylon, which was patterned on their own model, a quote-unquote Westminster-style majoritarian democracy in a unitary and centralized state. In retrospect, it's clear that this was the inappropriate, if not the wrong form of government for Sri Lanka, because it was very easily hijacked by majoritarian nationalists of the Sinhalese Buddhist community, who are about 70% of the Sri Lankan population. So is it fair to blame the British, the erstwhile colonial authorities, for everything that went so horribly wrong in a country like Sri Lanka subsequently, after independence? Probably not, without denying the colonial origins or roots of the subsequent problems of coexistence culminating in a protracted civil war. Because it didn't have to be the case that the state, not just the government, but the state in Sri Lanka would be symbolically and institutionally taken over and sought to be monopolized by majoritarian nationalists of the Sinhalese Buddhist community. It didn't have to be that way. This was a conscious, political and strategic choice made by the Sinhalese Buddhist political elites in the post-colonial period. During the first decade of Sri Lanka's independence, from 1947-1948 to roughly 1956, the Sri Lankan polity was in fact relatively stable, and it was still a fairly happy island that lived up to its image of serendipity, serendip, as Arab traders called Sri Lanka about a millennium ago. It all changed in 1956 when there was a political and strategic choice made by a very ambitious and dynamic Sinhalese Buddhist political entrepreneur, Solomon Bandaranaike, to harness Sinhalese Buddhist majoritarian nationalism as the basis of this political strategy. And of course, it's been a long story since then. To cut it very short, in the 1960s and 1970s, there was mounting discrimination in various spheres of governance, primarily targeted against the Tamil community, the Sri Lankan Tamil community, concentrated in the north and in the east of the country. Inter-community relations, majority-minority relations, were steadily poisoned but the roots of the problem are in the watershed development of 1956. And finally, things culminated in the outbreak of a civil war in 1983-1984, and many of us know or remember what the trigger to the outbreak of all-out civil war was. It was a pogrom-like riot directed against Sri Lankan Tamils living in Colombo and other Sinhalese majority parts of Sri Lanka. And in 1983, this was by no means the first episode of pogrom-like violence directed against the principal Sri Lankan minority group. But 1983 was the tipping point because it radicalized a younger generation of Sri Lankan Tamils, and all hell broke loose and continued for the next 25 years. So to go back to what I started with, let me sum up. I think in the case of some of our other neighbors, Nepal and Bangladesh in different ways come to mind, one can say that instability is the result of, as the framers of this panel's topic put it, the birth pangs of rising democracies. However, in another case, the case I gave as an example of why we can't blame the colonial past for things that have gone horribly wrong in the region, in the case of Sri Lanka, I think it's fair to say that instability, and that's a rather sanitized and limited term, given the horrors that unfolded over the last 25 years and even earlier in a country like Sri Lanka, I think it's fair to say that this was a case of democracy gone badly wrong, democracy being mismanaged, democracy being monopolized by members of one ethno-religious community to the marginalization and perhaps even the exclusion of other communities. That is a de facto, although not a de jure violation of equal citizenship rights. There's nothing wrong with majoritarian democracy in principle. That's the conventional model of democracy throughout the world. The problem begins when the fluid notions of majority and minority, which are at the heart of the principle of majority rule, that conception of democracy, become redefined as they were in this unfortunate neighboring country, in order to mean the permanent hegemony and the permanent marginalization of ethnic or ethno-national communities.
I think the question...
that is not that was not the original meaning of democracy, and I think that's an example of how democracy can go badly wrong, can be badly mismanaged, and lead to instability and conflict rather than stability. Thank you.
I think the question, of course, that we would like an answer to sometime would be how do we prevent history from repeating itself in the present context. But for the present, Mr. Kabatia, would you? This is something that you look at all the time when you're editing a journal on world affairs. So would you give us your perspective?
In a way, colonialism in its historic form, the legacy, is one thing, but there is also ongoing forms of colonialism. And speaking for the journal that you mentioned, we published an issue some time ago which was entitled Colonialism, New and Enduring Forms, which contain a number of contributions, perspectives on the various ways in which colonialism enforces itself, or at least tries to come back. One thing we should point out across the board still, of course, is that the introduction and the adoption of a Weberian state system with its democratic corollary has not been very well digested almost anywhere outside of what we call conventionally the Western world. And it's acknowledged by several scholars, such as Henri Favre, that democracy is a highly reversible thing. It's a compromise that has been reached at a particular period in history because of certain economic and political circumstances. But it's quite easy to go back to something very different. And we see in the West that some countries are going precisely that way. So the question is, if you look at Pakistan, for example, it's a case study in the creation of a state through a combination of civil unrest and colonial fiat, which of course has never worked and probably never will, because it's a sultanate which tries to pose as a democracy. I seem to be very harsh, but it's not harsh, it's just a statement of fact. If you look at the fact that the 5 provinces were cobbled together, and if you look at Bangladesh, it's definitely a result of Lord Curzon's decision to partition Bengal. So you have a few instances here of states that really are not rooted in history and have had a permanent conflict between their traditions and the polities that they were supposed to abide by. Now, I think that there is one word that was, I think, coined by Tom Engelhardt. It's democradura, which is a sort of democracy as a form, but with a very hardline, ongoing power structure, which is convenient for certain native and foreign interests. Now, this is clearly what we see being set up in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Democradura also implies that it's hard dura and it lasts, and it's sort of combination of dictatorship and democracy. This is what Pakistan should be or was, and it seems to be now breaking down, and of course American power has an interest in bringing it back, putting Humpty Dumpty together again. You see Turkey, for example, as a very good example of a democradura which was set up by Ataturk under Western auspices, although also as a rebellion against Western blatant colonialism. But if you look at Turkey as it has become now, which is much more democratic than it used to be, that is also because it has gone back to a number of its pre-Ataturk institutions. So there is a sort of a return to the Ottoman core. Just like China is trying to revive some of its Confucian and even Buddhist traditions of statecraft and public policy. And this, of course, means that democracy is by no means antithetical to tradition. On the contrary, it may need tradition to survive, because many of the native institutions were providing very interesting relays and also very interesting outlets for the expression of the popular will, such as, the Darbar in India, the Loha Jirga in Afghanistan. You can talk about the public assemblies in the Arab kingdoms, which may be seen as dictatorships in the Western perspective, but which in fact are probably much more democratic than some of the so-called republics that have been set up in the Western world.
So should these institutions have been allowed to flourish, which may or may not have had an effect on the state of instability, say in a state like Pakistan? And how would you, Mr. Bhattacharya, how would you distinguish between the fact that the birth of Pakistan created a certain reality, while the present reality in Pakistan points to a completely different origin?
Imrani, let me start off with the subject itself of British colonialism. I think, having lived in Africa, I'll say we're fortunate to have been ruled by the British rather than some other colonial power, because they did leave some institutions here. The process of democracy evolved here with the 1919 and 1995 acts. And I think we should also bear in mind that within the subcontinent, historically we've been one civilizational state, but the concept of a nation state is different. I think in the case of India, thanks to the founding fathers of the Constitution, we've been able to fashion a civilizational state into having many of the facets of a nation state. By the flexibility in the Constitution, the belief of unity in diversity, which was very central to Nehruvian thinking, however fashionable it may be critical of Nehru in this day and age. Now, in the case of the other countries in our neighborhood, Pakistan, the people of Pakistan never wanted a Pakistan. Punjab, Sindh and the frontier province didn't want Pakistan. Pakistan was a creation of a land-owning elite in the Muslim minority provinces of India. And therefore they've always had a confusion about what is their national identity. Jinnah was not Pakistani, it was Gujarati, for God's sake. When Bangladesh broke apart, I think it was not the military defeat, but the defeat of the belief that nations religion alone can constitute a basis of viable nationhood. And therefore, both in the case of Bangladesh and Pakistan, since they have not been able to define nationhood in very positive terms, anti-Indianism or anti the big boy becomes a unifying factor. You don't find that so much in Sri Lanka or in Bhutan, but you would find it in Nepal, because again the Nepalese state in its present form of the monarchy was really set up with a bit of Indian engineering. Now, therefore, I think as I see the problem, good to blame the British a bit, every colonial power makes its mistake, but it's really an exercise in nation building and developing a positive national identity. Our own structure comes under pressure when you talk of religion being the basis, uniformity rather than diversity being your strength. But by and large, I think that constitution has worked well. More importantly, one of the reasons for the complications are relations with neighbors. Apart from this, is really India has no history of handling foreign policy. That's the reality. And in economic terms, we were very insular. Nehruvian socialism was highly protectionist. We were able to contribute nothing to the economic growth of our neighbors. Right now, I think over the last 15 years, starting with Mr. Narasimha Rao, whom is very fashionable to criticize, we have now opened out our economy. We have a free trade area in South Asia. We have free trade arrangements with Southeast Asia. We are now becoming a part of a larger Asian economic family. And I think when economics adds to bringing people together, and Pakistan is the only one which is not joining this process, and Pakistan will pay its price for that. That's a different question. But the challenge therefore today is in many ways this: how to live together while defining separate sexes of nationhood which are not inimical. And secondly, I would suggest that in the case of Bangladesh and Pakistan, there is the added problem of the entire so-called Islamic world, and I don't believe that even that is a monolith, facing problems of what it is its identity in a larger world, a feeling of we are persecuted. I believe that's mistaken. So I think you are into several complexities. Let's not blame the Brits. I mean, they played games with us. You go to Pakistan, the Pakistanis are equally critical of the Brits. Jinnah said he got a motif in Pakistan. So I think they can't be wrong on both sides. The fact of the matter is, we have to set our house in order. We have to translate the Nehruvian political vision and not necessarily the economic vision into an abiding unity. And we don't have to be Indian, anti-Pakistani to be anti-Indian. Today to be a Pakistani, you have by definition to be an anti-Indian. Look at Guru Zardari is on his way out for saying the wrong things.
So the cause of instability is less important than how nations in South Asia can transcend its roots or its causes and move forward. Admiral Das, do you have a perspective on this?
An advantage of sitting next to the moderator is that you get to be the last speaker, and so you've heard others of what they have said.
You expect to be the short.
Yes. Let's see. Actually, whatever instabilities the colonial rule may have passed on to us, certainly in the form of military, a great amount of stability was passed on to us. Many people might not know that in the earliest days when the East India Company was here, there was no single British army. There were three armies: the Army of Bengal, the Army of Madras, the Army of Bombay. It took many decades before the three were combined and made one army. And then, of course, came the mutiny of 1857, and when the Crown took over India, then we had for the first time the Indian Army. And this is the Indian Army, and I included Indian Army, Navy and Air Force. This was transferred to India. Immediately after the war, this structure underwent two great traumatic events. One, lakhs and lakhs of people were demobilized because they had all been taken in during the war, but all very without fuss and without any repercussions. And two, the army was split. 1/3 to Pakistan, 2/3 to India. That itself was a very traumatic scene. But remarkably, throughout the partition riots, partition chaos and confusion, the army stood aloof. They did not participate in any of the undesirable activities. And this is what India inherited. What came to India with this army were two things. One was discipline. including the systems, the laws. If you look at the regulations Indian Navy, it is more or less a copy of the Queen's regulations and Admiralty instructions. If you look at our Army Act, Navy Act, Air Force Act, they take a lot from the British legislation on the system, on the subject. And these gave to the army from the very beginning a discipline which has stood this country in great stead. Look at the scene in 1975. There was a Nav Nirman Andolan on, and a call was given to the Indian army, disobey unlawful commands of the government. Who's to decide what is unlawful, what is not lawful? It did not affect the Indian army in the least. And it stood the test of this call to mutiny. It was a mutinous conduct that was called for. Many people might say that what the army does in terms of ceremonial, customs, tradition is a bit cosmetic, blow the bugle every so often, or play the bands, or stand up and mess tights and say, gentlemen, the president, bring the health. But all these are part of discipline, which makes life cohesive, which makes you an entity, an institution to act in support of the government. Now, why has this not happened in other countries? We have got Pakistan, we have got Bangladesh, we have got Nepal, we have Sri Lanka. Actually, in Nepal and Sri Lanka, the army has been as apolitical as it has been in India. In Sri Lanka, certainly. In Nepal, when the monarchy was there, when the democracy was there, it is only in Pakistan, and I call Bangladesh part of Pakistan, because in 1971, all those who grew had all been trained in Pakistan and were exposed to whatever had happened in Pakistan from 1950 onwards. All the people involved in the coup of 1975 when Sheikh was killed were all colonels, lieutenant colonels and majors who were trained in Pakistan post 1950 when Liaquat Ali Khan was murdered. So what is it that in India has led the country to be relatively stable despite all our problems, and for Pakistan to have become so unstable? And I think the cause can be attributed to one thing. In India, the military, which is a stable element, a strong pillar of state stability, has always had the benefit of strong and visionary political leadership. Whether it is Jawaharlal Nehru, whether Govind Ballabh Pant, whether Sardar Patel, whether Rafi Ahmad Kirbhai, whether Abdul Kalam Azad. But in Pakistan, with the assassination of Liaquat Ali Khan in 1950, political leadership has been in vacuum, unless you call Asif Zardari a political leader of great vision, or some of his predecessors. So this is what has happened. The other thing that has happened, and I say tongue-in-cheek since so many civil bureaucrats are present here today, that whereas in India, civil bureaucracy linked up with the political leadership, in Pakistan, civil bureaucracy post-1950 linked up with the military. Both suffered in consequence. In Pakistan, the civil bureaucracy became more or less ineffective. In India, the civil bureaucracy got to be called babus by us. So these two things have taken place which are so different in both countries. And I think this is one of the reasons why in India the army has been apolitical, has been out of the loop, as many people in the army complain. Whereas in Pakistan, the army is the loop itself. And that is what has led to the type of scenarios that we have in these two countries. Finally, all I will say is this, is that we have come this far, 6 decades, and the army continues to remain in India one of the major prongs of stability. As people of my generation would say, "Hum laaye hain tufan se kishti nikal ke." Now people of the present and the future have to ensure that the same scenario continues, because if this is eroded in some way or the other, then we are in difficulty. What are the problems that we have faced? One, all the ills of society naturally impact on the army, whether it is corruption, whether it is immoral activities, whether it is ethical values. At the same time, the army has become a much more egalitarian. The way in which an officer deals with his man today bears no comparison to the way an officer dealt with a man when I was a young officer, and therefore 20 years earlier.
In that case, is it now that we have established that there is a pattern of stability here, and is it not time to now look forward? How is it that India can help assist countries around it in the neighborhood to transcend the inherent instability factors that bedevil these countries? Because it is nobody's case that India would be able to do a very great job with its own economy or people or politics or even its foreign policy if it cannot help its own neighborhood go beyond its history. So for the historian, Professor Bose, how do we help or how do we assist countries in our periphery to transcend their history so that instability can be overcome?
Okay. Just a comment on Pakistan, which has been brought up. I think Pakistan is a case study of the principle of national self-determination gone horribly wrong, or perhaps it's more accurate to say it should never have been applied in the first place. Now, national self-determination is a very 20th century concept of quote-unquote Western origin, and its genesis is associated above all with Woodrow Wilson, the post-1918 President of the United States, and in a very different way around the same time with Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union. To move on from that to your question, Indrani, I'd like to pick up on a very interesting and I think a very important point that Mr. Carpentier made in his remarks. And it's about Turkey. Let me give an example in order to illustrate the point. It's taking us a bit beyond our region, but I think it's relevant to us in India and in the wider region. In Turkey in the last decade, there has been a cautious, gradual, and de facto jettisoning of many of the dogmas of Kemalism that underpinned the Republic of Turkey since its formation in the early 1920s. And as my co-panelist rightly noted, there has been a sort of return to some of the traditions of the Ottoman era, which for most of the Kemalist period, until about a decade ago, was regarded in the official ideology as a dark age, which is just not worthy of any attention, emulation in the early 21st century. But they've had a rethink, and China is also doing it in its own way. It's trying to dust off certain Confucian traditions and practices for the needs of the early 21st century. So maybe that's one way in which we can transcend the negative and debilitating aspects of our colonial heritage. Of course, that's too easy an answer, but I think there is something there. Turkey was born as part of a war of liberation, national independence against Western powers, but at the same time, the Kemalist elite was completely intent on aping the West. For example, Mustafa Kemal and his colleagues in the late 1920s just copied the Swiss Civil Code and made it the civil code of their new state. And that's just an example of how a certain mindless aping or imitation of Western practices, and of course we are still steeped 62 years later in our colonial heritage, how that can lead to a lot of problems, and even schizophrenic problems in the society, which is the case in Turkey. Much less for us, because we also have the heritage of our independence movement to balance the heritage of colonial rule. So maybe that's one way of transcending as I said, the negative and debilitating aspects of our colonial heritage.
Mr. Carpentier, the one country in the region that we didn't look at in both of these terms was Nepal. Nepal doesn't have the kind of colonial history that certainly India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka can do, but the current instability in Nepal could also needs to be addressed, not in terms of a rising democracy, but certainly in terms of a state being held together. And I think we're also looking at a kind of failing state in Nepal as well. Do you have any ideas of how India can assist or help Nepal in overcoming its current instability?
The other country we haven't mentioned is Myanmar or Burma, which I think is still also part of the South Asian region. But Nepal, again, Nepal in a way could be seen as a typical case of a state not born out, but preserved by its very fear of colonialism and the fact that the British decided that it was better to keep it as a buffer state rather than trying to rule it directly. Otherwise, let's face it, Nepal will be one of the many princely states in India. There is no great difference there. And I think if you see the difference, I mean the sort of disparities between Madhesh and the mountain region, somebody noticed some time ago that Nepal is one of the very few countries where the mountainous north rules the plain of the south, which is almost a historical and geographic anomaly, because normally it's always the plain central economy which rules the mountains. And that, of course, depended upon the feudal rule that Nepal was under. So if the feudal rule breaks down, you have a reconsideration of the very status of Nepal. Now, India's position vis-à-vis Nepal, as you know better than I can tell you, is of course very delicate, because it's by definition a very big neighbor. It's like, China versus Mongolia. And so you can hardly say anything to Nepal without being seen as essentially overbearing. So I would assume, however, that very clearly India has an interest in not letting Nepal become a Maoist state, whatever that will mean in the Nepalese context. Therefore, India will support a coalition of democratic and, let's face it, conservative or even reactionary forces, because that's probably the only way to keep Nepal manageable. Otherwise, you would have this kind of spillover effect into regions that are already seriously threatened by Naxalite insurgencies. Therefore, I would say, you can't say hand off Nepal, because that's not feasible, but obviously the more discreet the intervention is, the better. And I quite agree that, Nepal has an identity which is linked to the monarchy, so this sounds terribly reactionary, but I have had this said to me to many Nepalese, that without a monarchy, our identity seems to melt away. I mean, who exactly are we, except a sort of a remote region of the Indian subcontinent? So, is there a case for trying to work towards the creation of a constitutional monarchy, as in Bhutan?
And I will say thank you to everybody. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I'm glad everybody sort of participated very much. I think the last word being left to the moderator. I think we will leave today's discussion with the thought that colonialism or the pangs of new nations, the fact remains that large parts of South Asia remain unstable and will continue to be unstable, and it is probably in our interest to look for solutions that may be new, that may be out of the box, but certainly would work towards alleviating the kind of instability, the kind of poverty, and the development